Receiving an allowance without having to tackle household chores might sound like an ideal setup at first. However, living with my mother-in-law, Doris, complicates matters. At 34 years old and working as a web designer, I often find Doris's routine sarcasm can overshadow these supposed perks. My husband, Bobby, and I face numerous challenges under the same roof, primarily stemming from our conflicting views on work and domestic duties. After our wedding, I transitioned from a corporate job to freelancing, a move that both my former employer and I welcomed. This change has been advantageous, bringing a steady stream of projects from established clients and liberating me from the grind of daily commutes, allowing me more time to manage household responsibilities. Despite these benefits and Bobby's encouragement, Doris holds on to traditional beliefs about marriage, particularly the idea that a wife should primarily focus on homemaking. She often voices this sentiment, unwilling to acknowledge the validity of shared responsibilities in modern partnerships. To her, my freelance work appears trivial, and she questions its impact on our household finances. I strive to juggle my web design projects with household chores during my free time, but Doris remains unmoved by my efforts. Her dissatisfaction stems from a comparison between my contemporary approach to balancing work and home life and her outdated expectations. From her perspective, I may seem like an intruder disrupting the family dynamic, especially since she has leaned more on Bobby since his father's passing 4 years ago. Our home, once purchased by Bobby's father and now solely owned by Doris after settling the mortgage with life insurance, serves as a backdrop for these intergenerational conflicts. Navigating daily life within these walls involves managing the varied and often clashing viewpoints, striving to respect both traditional and modern family values. The house, with its thoughtfully designed layout, comfortably accommodates our small family and provides me with an ideal workspace. Despite the occasional tensions, it also serves as a popular gathering spot for Doris's friends, who have been part of the neighborhood for over 25 years. When these longtime friends come over, the atmosphere shifts, and I often take on the role of a gracious hostess, serving coffee and sweets. During their gatherings, the conversations among the group of women inevitably turn to their grievances about daughters-in-law. I can't help but chuckle as they recount their complaints. For example, one daughter-in-law frequently retreats to her parents' house over minor disagreements, spending nearly half the year away. They label her financially irresponsible, lamenting how her actions leave their sons bewildered and have even led to debt collectors knocking at their doors. These discussions, which often take place near my workspace, can take on a humorous tone. It feels as if Doris's friends engage in an informal contest to see who has the most troublesome daughter-in-law. Compliments about daughters-in-law are scarce in these exchanges. However, when one is occasionally praised for successfully managing a household while working, Doris's reaction is telling. She dismisses such achievements with a wave of her hand, reducing my work to nothing more than a side gig, all while the room fills with laughter. This blend of humor and criticism during their gatherings offers a unique glimpse into the generational differences in expectations and values regarding family roles, emphasizing the ongoing struggle to merge traditional views with modern family dynamics. Amid the lively banter and laughter that fill our living room when Doris hosts her friends, my job often comes under scrutiny. Doris openly questions the value of my work, inquiring about my earnings. This prompts a shift in conversation to the spending habits of daughters-in-law, underscoring a stark contrast with the traditional belief that a husband's income should be the family's primary support. The room erupts in laughter, finding humor in what seems to be an outdated notion of such expectations. During these moments, I occasionally feel overwhelmed by the repetitive stories and outdated perspectives. To cope, I slip on my headphones and focus on my work, trying to block out the subtle undertones of belittlement that seem directed at modern daughters-in-law like myself. One evening at a family dinner, my husband Bobby suggested buying a new car. Almost immediately, his mother, Doris, questioned why he would need my input on such a decision. Bobby tried to explain that we make significant choices together as a family, but Doris was firm, insisting that since he had the driver's license, he should have the final say on the car. Caught between them, I chose to defer to him tactfully, recognizing the underlying tension, where Bobby constantly seeks input from both me and his mother before making major decisions. This incident reflected an ongoing pattern in our family, raised by parents who valued collaboration over autonomy. Bobby believes in making decisions that consider everyone's perspective. Doris, however, influenced by the traditional values of her late husband, sees this as unnecessary. Her view, shaped by a more patriarchal upbringing, holds that Bobby should act independently, especially in financial matters. When Bobby consults me, it stirs Doris's frustration, leading her to accuse me of being overly controlling. This ongoing tension exposes the clash between traditional expectations and modern relationship dynamics, underscoring the challenge of balancing respect for past norms with present-day partnerships. Over time, I noticed that Bobby rarely stood up for me when Doris made critical comments. He would apologize later, but each time, his assurances felt less sincere. The incident with the car deepened my concerns. I had hoped he'd recognize that seeking my opinion wasn't a flaw, but instead, he seemed to feel that his constant deference to both of us was a form of kindness rather than indecisiveness. I also wished Doris could be more direct with her opinions, rather than using moments like these to criticize my involvement. A month later, Bobby's new car arrived. He and Doris were thrilled, inviting me for a celebratory drive. However, the mood soured when I learned the car cost an eye-watering $300,000. I voiced my concern about the financial strain of such an extravagant purchase, but Bobby brushed me off, suggesting we simply take out a loan. Doris jumped to his defense, reminding me that I had supposedly given him the freedom to decide. When I questioned the practicality of such an expense, Doris snapped, "You're not the one paying, so why complain?" Feeling marginalized in a decision that would impact us both, I tried to explain that my work contributes meaningfully to our household income, but Doris's reaction was unusually harsh. She dismissed my freelance work as a side job, scoffing that it couldn't compare to Bobby's six-figure salary. Just as I was about to defend my contribution, her contempt cut me off, and I found myself questioning how much longer I could stay in a relationship where my voice and financial input were so undervalued. As the confrontation unfolded, I noticed that my husband had withdrawn, avoiding any involvement. After tolerating this dynamic for far too long, I reached my breaking point when my mother-in-law, with cutting finality, said, "A daughter-in-law like you should just get out." Her words echoed painfully, not just as an insult but as a dismissal of everything I had endured. Anger and disappointment surged as I looked to my husband, who remained indifferent, blaming his chronic indecisiveness for the worsening situation. I replied, "Understood, then I will leave." I gathered my computer and essentials from my workspace and headed to the door, informing Doris that I'd return for the rest of my things later. She glared at me with anger, while my husband stayed conspicuously hidden in his room. As I crossed the threshold, Doris's voice rang out, "When you come back, it'll be to sign the divorce papers." Her abrasive words stunned me, and I left without replying, feeling as if I'd been pushed out of the life I'd tried so hard to make work. I found refuge at my parents' home, shaken and uncertain. My mother, sensing something was wrong, gently asked what had happened. Struggling to find the words, I expressed my regret and shared how much my husband had changed from the man who had once cherished me. Talking with my parents brought some relief. With no children complicating the situation, my mother suggested I seriously consider moving forward with a divorce, especially given my financial independence. Over the weekend, supported by my father, I began taking steps toward a new beginning. I returned to collect my belongings from the house I'd shared with my husband and his mother. They both seemed to avoid a final confrontation, and when I stood outside my husband's room, I quietly asked, "Will you sign the divorce papers?" I slid the documents under the door and soon heard his detached response, "I've signed, we're done here." Retrieving the signed papers was a hollow victory, marking the end of our marriage. Without a word to Doris, I left, feeling the weight of 3 years that held only fleeting moments of happiness. I went straight to the city office to submit the paperwork, hoping that this formal closure would help me move on. The plan was to temporarily stay with my parents and work remotely while I rebuilt my life. As I settled into this new phase, my mother suggested I stay with them a while longer. "It's less worrying than you being on your own," she said, and my father echoed her concerns, cautioning that Bobby or his mother might show up unexpectedly. Though I initially doubted this, living with my parents felt like a comforting choice. Fortunately, my flexible work arrangement made it easy to settle back in. 3 months passed, and as Bobby and Doris began to fade into distant memories, an unknown number started calling my phone. After several persistent calls, I finally answered, only to hear my ex-husband's anxious voice asking, "Why haven't you been answering?" Calmly, I replied that we had no reason to communicate further, and I was about to hang up when his next question stopped me. "Why isn't my smartphone working?" Barely interested, I suggested he contact the phone company, but then a thought struck me. I asked if he had been making regular deposits into our old joint account. Previously, we both contributed, my steady salary alongside his variable income from health product sales, which was often unpredictable. Until I'd left, I'd regularly topped up the account, but over the past 4 months, only his deposits had kept it afloat. It dawned on me that I'd left mid-month and that loan payments for the new car had likely started. The line went silent as he absorbed this realization. I calmly added, "I've covered our household expenses so far, but from here on, you'll need to manage your own." I held back the urge to say, "You reap what you sow," and ended the call quietly. Reflecting on it, I realized that he had likely kept his actual earnings hidden from Doris. She seemed unaware that I had been the primary earner after our marriage, oblivious to how much I'd actually contributed. It occurred to me that he'd perhaps been too embarrassed to admit that his wife had kept the household running. Now, with the household income disrupted, his phone service seemed to be the first luxury to go, underscoring the financial strain left in my absence. One holiday morning, the insistent buzz of our house intercom broke the quiet. My father, visibly irritated, responded firmly to the visitor. "We don't want to be involved with you anymore. Please leave." Concerned, my mother and I joined him at the entrance, where the familiar voice of my former mother-in-law filtered through, pleading for a chance to talk. I stepped forward to face her, and as predicted, she looked furious. Without preamble, she launched into accusations, blaming me for missing the monthly deposits, which she claimed had led to their utilities being cut off. Stunned, we exchanged confused glances, unsure of what she meant. My ex-husband tried to interject, saying, "Mom, stop it. Doris isn't responsible for us anymore," but she dismissed him, pressing on. "Bobby makes $7,500 a month. How could this happen?" Quietly, I corrected her. $7,500 was my income, not Bobby's. Her expression shifted to shock as she turned to Bobby, who hesitantly confirmed that his take-home pay was around $2,500. After a long pause, she turned back to me, astonished. I explained that my income came from a steady job, not an allowance. Then, to my surprise, she made a desperate suggestion. "Doris, what if you came back?" It was surreal to hear her propose that I return after pushing me to leave in the first place. Calmly, I declined, stating there was no going back. The conversation exposed the depth of the financial misconceptions and resentment that had strained our relationships. I firmly reminded her that we were divorced, and it was no longer my concern. Despite my refusal, she continued to insist we could fix everything if I reconciled with Bobby. At this, my father stepped forward, his patience worn thin. He demanded they leave immediately, warning that he would call the police if they didn't. They retreated hastily, almost stumbling on the way out, as he warned them never to return. In the aftermath, my mother and father were both visibly indignant. I felt a wave of relief, reassured that we had severed ties with such unreasonable people. In time, through a mutual acquaintance of my ex-husband's, I learned how things had unraveled for him. Forced to sell his parents' house and the land, he had moved with his mother to a modest apartment. Even the barely used car had been sold to pay off its loan. Though the debts were settled, he continued making reckless choices, ultimately losing his remaining money to gambling. Eventually, his whereabouts became unknown. His mother, meanwhile, was diagnosed with dementia and now resides in a nursing home. On a brighter note, my career has flourished, and I'm living independently. Recently, I began dating a colleague who is well aware of my past. He's hardworking and responsible, entirely self-reliant and doesn't indulge in unnecessary expenses, a refreshing change from my previous marriage. While marriage hasn't been a topic yet, I feel confident about our future, sensing a serious and genuine potential in our relationship.